Hi, I'm Steve Kaplan and welcome again to PSD Tuts. In this tutorial we'll look at how to create 3D objects directly in Photoshop from artwork that we create in Photoshop, in other words using no external sources. And let's start off by extruding some basic text. I've set the foreground colour to grey so it brightens it up a little, and now I'll just use the text tool and I'll type in the word text. And this is in Baskerville bold, and I'm just going to tighten up this kerning a little bit so it looks a little bit better. All we have to do now is go onto the 3D panel, and we've got 3D extrusion chosen by default, and just click on Create. And there is our 3D text. As quickly as that. That's really all there is to it. And we can pick it up and move it around just like any 3D object. If you don't want to go through the 3D panel to do this, you can do it through the 3D menu instead. And you would go to 3D and New 3D Extrusion from Selected Layer. So what can we do with this text? Well, we can manipulate it in lots of different ways. And in a future tutorial we'll look at different methods for twisting, turning, revolving and extruding this text. For now, the simplest approach is we're going to make it thinner, and we can do that just by making the whole object thinner. And we've looked before at how to scale a 3D object using the 3D controller in the middle. So there is our text, and you can see we can manipulate that pretty much as we want. We'll turn that round again. Now, in earlier versions of Photoshop, what used to happen, it used to be that in order to make text into a 3D object, you had to rasterize it first. In other words, you had to turn it into regular pixels so that it stopped being standard text. Well, that's no longer the case in CS6. We can do far more with it. For example, if we look on the 3D panel, we can see everything that defines our text here. There is our text layer selected. Now, if we go onto the Properties panel, the Properties panel is the new panel in CS6 that is context sensitive, so it changes depending on what you have selected. We can click the color swatch at the bottom of the panel, and now we can choose a brighter color for our text. So we can change it to red. Okay, so far so good. We can take it further. We can click on the character panel, and that opens up the character panel here. At the moment this is in Baskerville bold, but we could change it to just about any font we wanted on our system. I could change it to Arial. And there is the text changed. Even though we have turned it into a 3D object, we can still manage to change the font. We can even edit the wording itself by dragging down to the bottom of the Properties panel and clicking the Edit Source button. Now this will open up our text in a new window, and we've looked at these PSB windows before. They're the internal file format that Photoshop uses. So we could change this to, for instance, PSD Tuts. Hit Enter to apply that text, and now go to the File menu and Save. And when we do this, it saves this back into our document, and there is our reworded text. And we can make it smaller so we can read the whole word. Well, once again, we can pick it up, move it around, do anything we like to it. A quick word here about how we move things around. We can either do it with using this 3D controller, or by clicking on any face of the object, and you get this useful pop-up help that tells you what you're doing. So I'm here moving on the Z-axis, sliding it back and forth. We can rotate by going over an edge, or we can rotate freely by just dragging it outside it. Now the problem we get here is, let's say we get it in a position like this, but we want to straighten it up again. We can try and do it by dragging, but it's actually very difficult to do. Well, there's an easier way. We can do it all numerically. We can go onto the Properties panel once again, and we can click on the final icon, which is the coordinates icon. Here, all we have to do is to set our coordinates back to 0, and we can square up whatever object we're working on. We might want to have the word PSD tuts lying on its back. We can change the X angle from 0 to 90 degrees simply by typing in 90. And when we hit enter, it applies that to our text. The text, as you can see, is now floating above the ground plane, but we can easily go to the 3D menu, choose Snap Object to Ground Plane, and then it drops down. If we want to view it more from the top without changing its position on that ground plane, all we have to do is to click off it. Now when we drag, we're moving the whole 3D arena. When we click back on the text, we can now drag it around by clicking on the relevant sides and moving it. So that is the simplest way of making a 3D object. We've made it from text. We could make it in other ways. Let's try a different method. We'll make a new layer, and on this layer we can paint with the brush tool. Let's paint a little wiggly line and maybe make the brush larger and put a blob on the end of it. I'm not painting anything particular here, just making a random shape. When we switch to the Move tool, we can look again at the 3D panel and say, yep, let's make a new extrusion from this. And there is our object instantly turned into a 3D shape that we can manipulate just as we did before. Let's make another layer. This time we'll draw a path with the pen tool. I'm drawing a random shape here, and inside this I'm going to draw another shape. And as you'd expect with the pen tool, paths inside each other are removed, so they mutually exclude each other when you have multiple paths like this. And again, I'm going to just create a 3D object, and this time I'll say from this path. And there's our object. And once again, we can drag it around. We can change the depth of it. And we can do pretty much what we want with this path. Now, because it's a path and not based on pixels, we can edit that path. So once again, with this selected, we make sure we have our path chosen in the 3D panel, and then in the Properties panel we can go down to Edit Source, and there is our path showing up for us. Let's make this a bit smaller. So on here we can pick up part of the path, reshape it, and when we go to save, it saves that information back into our 3D object, and now we can pick up this object and we can carry on working with it. What we can also do is to combine two objects, and this is very clever. So let's take this path and let's turn on this layer that we created earlier. We'll hide the path for a moment, so we're just looking at the lower layer, and let's make this a little bit thinner so it doesn't extrude so far. Now the trouble is, we're viewing this from one position and we're viewing the path from a completely different position. And as we switch between the layers, we can see our ground plane, our whole world that we're viewing these through, changes. Well, that's okay. If we select both of these, we can merge them together by going to the 3D menu and choosing Merge 3D Layers. And now these have both been placed in the same universe, if you like, along the same 3D space, and we can move them together. What's more interesting is the fact that we can move them separately, and we can do that by looking in the 3D panel. There is the layer we created using the brush tool, here is a layer we created using the pen tool. So we can take this layer created with the brush tool and we can manipulate this by itself. And you can see, because these are now making a single 3D object, they actually intersect each other where they cross over. We can have them passing through each other in this way. As we turn it around, we can see actually it is a single object and they will merge together when they're both placed in the same position. And this is incredibly useful. It means we can take our basic extrusion techniques and then we can use those to create something far more complex that we can then manipulate, if we want, as a single object. So a very, very useful technique that greatly expands the range of what we're able to do with Photoshop. When we look at the main 3D panel in Photoshop, we can see everything laid out for us in a hierarchical order. We have the environment, we have the scene itself, and within that we have the current view, which is the camera that we're using, and we have each object. And as we choose each of these, you can see that the Properties panel changes to display the options for that particular selection. This is very useful. Even on this object, which you remember we created using the brush tool, when we click on the Edit Source button, it opens our original drawing in the new window. We could now use any of our tools on here. We could use the Eraser tool, and we can knock a hole in the middle of this end piece, and when we save it, that hole is now saved back into our artwork. We've got these two layers combined, the path layer, the brush layer. We've also got our text layer. We can bring that in as well. Let's take that and select that with our composite layer. Once again, we can merge these layers together, and now we have them all as a single object. But even though they're all a single object, we can still work on them one at a time. We can take our text layer, select it in our 3D panel, and now we can move it around, we can rotate it, we can treat it just as we like, and it'll interact with the other objects that it's part of, but we can also treat it separately. And as always, because it's a text layer, we can edit the text. Even though we've extruded it, we've changed the text, we've revolved it, we've combined it with two other objects, we can still go down to the bottom of our Properties panel, edit the source, and make that say anything we like. And that, I think, is amazing.